we talk a lot here in the carnivore world about needing to connect to our local resources, to our local ranchers and local dairy producers and all the rest of it. We use the language of the tribe, as in like the carnivore tribe or the carnivore community or any other variation of these things. You've seen this language deployed before. What we run up against often is this value being pushed by the world, this concept called sustainable development. And I went over the underlying value or the very core idea of it in my previous one of these kind of videos, and that was on the seven generations principle. And what the seven generations principle is, for those who might not have seen it, is the simple idea that we should not take any actions today for development purposes that can negatively impact the ability of future generations, 7 generations from now, to meet their goals. If that sounds insane to you, it should, because to give you some context, that would be allowing the people running the world in 1848 to have to decide whether they could meet their own needs in their time by looking to us here in the year 2023. That should sound insane to you. Aside from basically making sure that things like water tables and the air aren't destroyed, we don't really know what future generations are going to need in 175 years. That having been said, this idea came from a lot of different places. It came from the world of environmental philosophy, it came from the activist world, it came from a lot of places, and it coalesced into, well, the influence in our time of probably the most important document ever written on sustainable development, and that is the book by the United Nations called Our Common Future. That work is seminal in the defining of sustainable development and all of the goals set by that body, that so-called non-governmental organization, since then. And that book came out in the mid-1980s. I have a physical copy of it, actually. I would recommend, if you could find a copy, to read it. You can find a PDF on it online from their website. It's a legal free copy you can read. They want you to read this. And there was one value that in the sustainability literature that comes from that document that you hear the rhetoric from a lot of the lower tier activists for sustainable development, and that is the concept of local control. And what do they mean by local control? They mean that to achieve sustainability, to have an economy that can be safe for us and safe for future generations, would require sustainable local control, meaning local actors, local governments, at the most local level, doing what is necessary to, well, achieve these goals. That the core idea being that local people know what's best for themselves. Not a terribly radical concept. Most people of most political stripes could, in theory, get behind this. And you might think, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is they don't actually believe it, because we see it through their actions. The language since the 1980s, in Our Common Future, that document has a bunch of references to local authority, decentralization, local expertise, that kind of thing. But since then, their rhetoric has gone from local control to working with local people to achieve these goals. There's a marked difference. An actor from an international organization or a national government can show up in your small podunk town, like the one I live in. I live in a small podunk town. Someone with a badge from an international organization with some perceived authority now can come and tell me we must do X, Y, and Z in my town that they know nothing about. But they will take us under advisement. That is the new rhetoric. That is their new, well, that's what they say and what they do in action. And that is a massive problem we're going to run up against, not just as carnivores, but anybody who's concerned with a proper human diet, human thriving, human nutrition, getting rid of processed foods. Because at the end of the day, you and I can make decisions for ourselves. Our communities can make decisions for ourselves. Our communities have cattlemen and ranchers and people who raise all sorts of livestock and grow the plants that, if you're eating plants, they grow those things. But these bodies now want to exert external control over everything. And you see this with the more recent documents that that the UN has put out on sustainable development. They have now goals for every 10 years or something, and the ones coming at the end of this decade openly call for international organizations to make rulings on such things, for the control to be taken as far from local people as possible. And there's a simple reason for that, because it turns out local people don't want what they're selling. It's as simple as that. That most of us in our communities don't see the effects that they say are coming, that we need to be so worried about, that requires giving more power to people who have nothing to do with us, who can make decisions over us, in theory, for us. That's what's at the core of this, is the overturning of the concept of a local identity for people, local control for people, and local autonomy. Most of us who have bought a whole cow or half a cow or bulk beef of some kind typically buy it from somebody local. And there are some basic logistics reasons for that. We buy these cows locally because how would you ship a whole parted out cow? I don't know what that would even look like. The logistics behind that are mind-blowing. I'm sure you could probably buy a full cow parted out from some local butcher or some national butcher box kind of operation. Why would you want to? Most of the time, you're going to get the best deal from meat from your neighbors. That's just a fact when it comes to buying whole cows. I paid $4.50 a pound for the whole prime grade, grass-fed, grain-finished cow that I have in my freezer. What's left of it anyway. Our values as carnivores, regardless of whatever our political views and our individual religious views and all the rest of it, are one of the things that seems to be a common, if unspoken thing, is this focus on local. Whether we really understand it or not. How many of you would buy a whole cow if you could? Even if you can't afford it, would you buy one if you could? If you had the space or the financial ability to do it, whatever that's stopping you, would you do it? The answer most of the time to that question is yes. And when you ask them, well, where would you buy it? They're not saying they're going to go down to Walmart. They're not going to go contact Safeway to buy it. They're going to contact a local rancher. And most people just sort of stop there with the thinking. But when it comes back to, that language of tribe and that language of community and this understanding that we have been sold a bill of goods in the 20th century about proper human nutrition, and the main drivers for that have been centralized, faraway operations that really don't care about you or I. They just want to make a dollar. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to make money, but what there is something wrong with is the disconnect and the willingness, the ruthlessness to do it at all costs. And what is a worse motivating factor than money? It's power. It always has been. It's not a controversial thing to say. Most everyone is suspicious of those with enormous amounts of power, and for good reason. Unchecked power is almost always a disaster, leads to disaster. And the further away it is from those who are impacted by it, the worse the results are. And now we see this in the sustainable development world with all sorts of these weird goals set by these organizations that have no legal standing anyway. These are agreements made between governments, and these documents sometimes say that it's perfectly within their vision to force governments who don't want to comply to go along with their program. That should upset anybody. It doesn't matter what your politics are. But it does not upset everybody. In the carnivore space, this is something we are going to run up against over and over again. Part of the goals for the sustainable development goals is to get people to eat less meat. That is one of the stated goals. How are they going to do it? Well, in the latest iterations of the goals set by the UN, you see now not just governments but corporations participating. So they will access the halls of power with their money. Now, the corporations really only want to make money, but at least at legal organizations, but they are populated by human beings who are true believers in this stuff. And so many of them will force us to use it. They will use their powers to manipulate markets to get us to eat less and less meat, whether it's through propaganda or whether it's through just producing less meat and being invested heavily in the mechanisms of production for making plant-based meats and putting it on the market. At some point, what are you going to do, for instance, if you go to the store and your ribeye steaks are $25 a pound in the US and there isn't that many of them there, but the meat case is filled with those plastic looking fake steaks that I've done videos on before? What are you going to do? This is why local control is critical. And this is why getting to know your neighbors and your local meat producers is critical. And I'm going to mention this here again as I close this out. I want to start a Patreon, not necessarily for, like whatever other carnivore talking heads do with their Patreons. I'm not qualified to do coaching for you. Be wary of anybody wanting to do coaching for you unless they are actually a trained carnivore coach. Or maybe they can get you to carnivore coaches. Okay, I'm not throwing any shade at anybody here, but I'm not qualified to give you coaching. What I'd use a Patreon for is to build a website to facilitate your ability to buy meat either locally or from maybe the next state over or something from an independent producer. It's a database. I've seen really bad databases like this online, and I don't mean bad in terms of the way they look, and bad in terms of, it would say like the state of Arkansas has 3 cattle ranchers who you can buy beef from, which is laughable on its face. It's a monumental undertaking, though. If you're interested in that, let me know in the comments, because this is something that would be open to the entire carnivore community. This would be my suggestion to people, is whether it's through what I'm suggesting or some other initiative, that we answer the objection that they are going to have, the other side is going to have, with their words about local control and all this other stuff while imposing things from distant mega power bodies, is to really actually work for local control ourselves, to really work for making our local ties stronger, more vibrant. That way we can stand up against all these bad ideas they have with something else, by saying, we don't need your stuff here. We are far more sustainable than anything you're offering. Yes, I eat a cow, but it was raised in a regenerative manner, topic I'll cover eventually, and from someone just 20 miles from my house. It used very little carbon to get to me. In fact, that cow produced less carbon than, an equivalent amount of veggie patties that you want me to eat. We need to be able to make these arguments with hard data. That way we can expose what they're doing as more ideology than science. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help, as does sharing this on social media. That helps a lot too. I'm Anthony Stine, the Practical Carnivore. Thanks for tuning in.